I didn't know which story to read to you next, so I've decided to read this one. This one is called Magic Elizabeth by Norma Kassirer, Kassirer. Now, I remember reading this when I was a little girl, and it's a scholastic book, and it was a copyright 1966. I was born in 58, so it would have been, I would have read it not too long after it came out. I'm going to read the back of it to you. I wonder where the doll is, Sally whispers. I'd like to find her. Then I won't be so lonely in this creepy old house. Maybe she's in the attic. Aunt Sarah warned me not to go up there, but she won't know. Softly, Sally climbs the dark stairs, her heart beating fast. All right, now let's start reading this book and see what it's about. Let me show you the picture on the cover. And that's the back. Picture on the back. It's for Karen and Sue. And here's the first illustration. Now, rainy night. It all began one rainy night at the end of a summer. As if we didn't have enough troubles, groaned Mrs. Chipley. There it goes and rains on us. Sally, clinging to Mrs. Chipley's plump hand, was almost running to keep up with her. The bright feather on Mrs. Chipley's black hat, which had started out so proudly erect, had gradually wilted, and now drooped sadly down the back of that lady's stout neck. Sally's red suitcase, its handle firmly gripped by Mrs. Chipley's other hand, bumped in a steady rhythm against her right leg. But Mrs. Chipley strode purposely on as if she had no time to notice small discomforts. The two of them had come all the way across the city on the bus, and during the ride the sky had darkened and the streets had bloomed all at once. High-piling storm clouds snuffed out the light of the round orange moon. As they stepped off the bus, the branches of the tall trees rattled like bones in the wind. And now it was raining, a nasty, cold, stinging rain mixed with wet leaves torn from the groaning trees. It splashed and flew about them as they hurried along the gloomy street, as if the faster they went, the more they stirred up the fury of the night. Their coattails snapped behind them. Rain flew into Sally's eyes and even into her mouth, and it dribbled unpleasantly beneath the collar of her coat. Raindrops hitting a large mailbox echoed like drum beats down the street. Sally's long red hair, fluttering banner-like behind her, gave their small procession a brave look. And yet Sally at least was not feeling brave at all, quite the contrary. Troubles, Mrs. Chipley went on, but it's a lucky thing that your Aunt Sarah's come back to town just now when we need her. I don't recall her at all, panted Sally. I was just a baby when she went away to California. Going back again, too, pretty soon, your ma tells me, said Mrs. Chipley. Only came back here to sell the house. But never you mind, honey, she went on without slackening her furious pace at all. She's your own kin and the only one you have here in town. I'm sure I didn't know what else to do but call her, what with your mom and dad away on that business trip, and we don't want to spoil it for them, and it's not as if you'd have to stay with your aunt forever. A few days and I'll have my daughter straightened around and come back. And it was your own ma left her name in case of an emergency. I wonder what she's like, Sally said, but Mrs. Chipley did not seem to hear her. And if my daughter's getting sick like that and 5 kids to take care of and her poor husband working day and night to keep food in their mouths isn't an emergency, then I'm sure I don't know what is. Mrs. Chipley stopped so suddenly that Sally bumped into her. Mrs. Chipley, who was not very much taller than Sally herself, though a good deal bigger around, placed a steadying arm about Sally's shoulder and then peered up through the blowing rain at a street sign. She shook her head, sighed, and placed the red suitcase on the sidewalk. Land's sake, my glasses are all fogged over and wet. Can you read the sign, honey? Sally shaded her eyes and stood up on tiptoe. squinting to make out the letters on the sign in the uncertain gleam of a street light. The blowing shadows of tree branches came and went over the words on the sign. The letters wavered, grew taller, then shorter, seemed to disappear entirely. "It says Forest Road," she said at last. "Can't you hear, dearie? Your voice is gone all husky. Can't hear you, dearie. Your voice is gone all husky. Hope you don't go getting the cold now on top of everything else." "Forest Road," said Sally, more strongly this time. "That is it," said Mrs. Chipley, nodding vigorously. "Forest Road. Come along, honey." And picking up the suitcase, she led the way down Aunt Sarah's street. Sally's hand crept back into hers. "Now watch the numbers on the houses," Mrs. Chipley said. "It's 82 we want. Your young eyes are better than mine." "But there aren't any houses," said Sally, for as far as she could see, all down the street on either side were buildings, tall buildings, the light from their windows streaming out into the blowing street. Like the letters on the street sign, the buildings seemed to waver behind the lashing curtains of rain. A leaf danced in one of the streams of light for a moment and then vanished into the darkness. "It's a funny sort of street for your aunt to live on, all right," said Mrs. Chipley. "All these apartment buildings. But if it's Forest Road, it's got to be your Aunt Sarah's street. For sure you read that sign right, honey." "Yes," said Sally. The hand which clung to Mrs. Chipley's grew suddenly very cold. Mrs. Chipley looked down as if she noticed it too. She squeezed Sally's hand gently. "There, honey," she said. "You're not scared, are you?" Sally shook her head, but she was scared. She was scared of the strange dark street with the rain splashing in the gutters, of the wind-blown shadows shivering over the walk, of the tall buildings looming over them and seeming to watch them with the glittering eyes of their windows, and of her aunt. Whose street was this and whom she did not know at all? Mrs. Chipley squeezed her hand again. "Now, don't you be scared," she said kindly. "Everything'll look better tomorrow morning. Just you wait and see. Why, you're no baby. You're 8 years old, aren't you?" "Almost 10, Sally answered. "Almost 10? Well, now, that's too old to be scared of your own great aunt. Why, when I talked to her on the phone, she said, well, you may bring the girl over, was what she said. And I'll tell you, the connection wasn't good, what with this storm coming, so I couldn't hear her real good. But I'd say she sounded kind. Yes, that's what she sounded, kind. It was hard to tell, of course, but if it'd been a better connection, she'd have sounded just as kind as could be. I'm sure of that." Mrs. Chipley's words, blown back to Sally by the wind as they continued hurrying along, seemed somehow as cold and unassuring as the rain which accompanied them. "Watch for the numbers now, sweetie." "Watch for the numbers now, sweetie. Oof, this rain. We'll be soaked to the skin for sure, and poor Mrs. Chipley has to run right back to the bus stop to get the train for my daughters on time. Can't even stop for a cup of tea. And I expect your Aunt Sarah'll want me to. Trouble. 90, said Sally. "What's that, dearie?" "It says 90 on that building." "There we go then. It'll be on this side of the street and not so far off at that." Mrs. Chipley, to Sally's relief, had slowed down. "You don't suppose your aunt lives in one of these buildings, do you?" she asked, looking up at one of them. "Can't be, though. It's a house she came back to sell, an old house." "I'm scared," thought Sally. "Take me with you, Mrs. Chipley. I won't be any trouble, I promise." But she didn't say any of it. 88, she said instead. 86. 86? Oh, we're close, all right. What's this? Mrs. Chipley stopped. Sally stood still beside her, staring where Mrs. Chipley was pointing. "What's this?" she asked again. "It's a house," whispered Sally. She knew now what it meant to feel your heart sink. Hers seemed to be somewhere around her toes. For the peaked roof of what must be a house could just be seen above the top of a line of tall, scraggly bushes that formed an untidy hedge along the edge of the sidewalk. It was the only house as far as they could see on the entire street. As they stared, they heard a creaking sound and saw, almost hidden by the overgrown bushes, a pretty little wrought iron gate moving slowly back and forth in the wind, screeching quite plaintively as it moved. It seemed to Sally at that moment the saddest sound she had ever heard. "What's those numbers on the gate, dearie?" Sally bent her head to peer at them. She put a hand upon the gate to hold it still. The metal was cold and wet. She shivered. The number on the gate was 82, just as she had feared. She told Mrs. Chipley. "This is it then, honey. Come along." And Mrs. Chipley, still holding Sally's hand, pushed the gate open with the suitcase she held in the other hand and led the way along a path into Aunt Sarah's garden. Behind them the gate began its monotonous complaint again. "The house is dark," said Sally, and her voice was trembling. "Never mind that," said Mrs. Chipley briskly. "This is it, all right. I expect she's somewhere at the back of the house where we can't see, no doubt in the kitchen, hotting up that tea," she added longingly. It looked, Sally thought in despair, like a witch's house. She was suddenly afraid that she might begin to cry. "Don't you dare," she ordered herself. "Don't you cry." Ashamed to have to refuse that cup of tea, Mrs. Chipley was murmuring, shaking her head. That's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 is A Strange Lady, and we'll read it next.